The burlap sack smelled of old grain and desperation. Beneath it, in the suffocating darkness, she could hear the murmur of the crowd growing restless. "Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to our final lot of the day." The auctioneer's voice carried across the town square of Timber Falls, Montana territory, with practiced showmanship. A woman of unknown qualities, sold as is. Perfect for a man needing help with his homestead. Strong back, good hands. That's all I can vouch for, folks. Laughter rippled through the assembled crowd. It was 1887, a hard year in a hard land, and the timber town had seen stranger things than a woman sold sight unseen. The burlap covered her completely, tied at her waist and ankles, a shapeless form on the auction block. Only her boot showed beneath the coarse fabric, scuffed and worn thin at the toes. "We'll start the bidding at $10. Who'll give me 10? Silence answered him. The crowd shifted, men looking at their boots, women whispering behind gloved hands. The autumn wind carried the scent of sawdust from the mills and wood smoke from 100 chimneys. "Come now, gentlemen. $10 for a woman willing to work. That's cheaper than a good mule, and she'll complain less." More laughter, but still no bids. The auctioneer's smile tightened. "All right then, $5. Surely someone needs help before winter sets in proper." A longer silence this time. The woman beneath the burlap stood perfectly still, her breathing shallow. She'd learned not to move, not to draw attention. Movement brought pain. $2 then. The auctioneer's voice had lost its jovial tone. $2, and we can all get out of this cold and back to our dinners. $2 for a woman, sight unseen. It's a gamble, sure, but what in this life isn't? At the back of the crowd, a man straightened. He was tall, shoulders broad from years of swinging an axe, hands scarred and calloused from timber work. His name was James Crawford. And he'd come into town for supplies, not for entertainment. But something about the stillness of that burlap-covered figure pulled at him. Something about the way the crowd laughed while a human being stood there, faceless and voiceless, stirred an old anger in his chest. $2, he called out, his voice rough from disuse. James wasn't a man who spoke often. Up in his timber claim, 15 miles from town, he went days without hearing a human voice besides his own. The crowd turned to look at him. Some faces showed surprise, others showed pity. James Crawford was known as a fair man but a strange one, preferring his solitude to society, his trees to people. Sold to James Crawford for $2. The auctioneer banged his gavel with obvious relief. "Come collect your purchase, sir." James pushed through the crowd, fishing $2 silver from his pocket. They felt heavier than they should, weighted with the reality of what he'd just done. He'd bought a human being. The wrongness of it sat bitter in his throat, but leaving her there, leaving her to whatever fate awaited an unwanted woman in a frontier town, seemed worse. He handed over the coins and stepped onto the platform. Up close, he could see her trembling. The burlap rose and fell with quick, frightened breaths. "I have a wagon," he said quietly, speaking to her though he couldn't see her face. "I'll take you somewhere private before I remove that sack. You have my word as a Christian man." She didn't respond, but he saw the trembling ease slightly. "Can you walk?" he asked. A small nod beneath the burlap. He offered his arm, uncertain if she could even see it through the coarse weave. After a moment, her hand found his forearm, fingers gripping tight through his wool coat. Her hand was small, thin, shaking. They walked through the crowd together, and James felt the weight of every stare, heard every whispered comment. Let them talk. People had been talking about James Crawford for years. The hermit lumberjack. The man who'd rather fell trees than court a woman. The strange one who read books and kept to himself. His wagon waited at the edge of the square, hitched to his 2 sturdy draft horses. He helped her up onto the bench, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. She moved carefully, as if in pain. That stirred his anger again, hot and protective, though he couldn't have said why. He didn't know this woman. Didn't know her story. But he knew cruelty when he saw it, and that burlap sack was an act of cruelty. James climbed up beside her and took the reins. The crowd had already begun to disperse, the entertainment over, the strangeness of it already becoming a story they'd tell over dinner. "Did you see Crawford bought that sack, woman? $2. Wonder what he'll find when he opens his package." The 15-mile journey to his claim took 3 hours in the fading afternoon light. James didn't speak, and neither did she. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the plod of hooves, and the whisper of wind through the pine trees that grew thicker as they left town behind. His cabin sat in a clearing he'd cut himself, surrounded by towering pines and Douglas firs. It was a good cabin, solid and tight, built to withstand mountain winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it had kept. "We're here," he said, setting the brake. "This is my home. You'll be safe here." He climbed down and came around to help her. She took his offered hand, that same trembling grip, and let him guide her down. He led her inside, into the warmth of the main room. It smelled of wood and leather and the venison stew he'd left simmering. "I'm going to remove the sack now," James said, positioning her near the fireplace where the light was good. "I need you to know, before I do, that you're safe here. Whatever's under there, whatever happened to you, you're safe. Do you understand?" A pause, then a nod. "I'm going to untie the rope at your waist first." His fingers worked the knot, rough and tight, tied by careless hands. It took a minute to loosen. The rope fell away, and the burlap loosened. He grasped the bottom edge. "Ready?" Another nod. He lifted the burlap up and off in one smooth motion, stepping back to give her space, to give her dignity. The woman who stood before him was thin, terribly thin, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. Her dress was little more than rags. Her brown hair hung lank and uncombed down her back. But her face was whole and unmarked, and her eyes were the color of spring leaves, bright green even in the firelight. Those eyes met his, and he saw fear there, yes, but also a strange, desperate hope. "My name," she said, her voice hoarse and cracking from disuse, "is Eliza Crawford." The name hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back a step, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Eliza Crawford died 15 years ago. The fever took her and her whole family. Everyone but me." She wrapped her arms around herself, swaying slightly. "They left me for dead in the mass grave. But I woke up in the darkness, and I clawed my way out. I was 12 years old, and I had nowhere to go." James couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Eliza Crawford. Little Eliza with the green eyes and the laugh like bells. The girl who'd followed him everywhere when they were children, who'd promised to marry him when they grew up, who died when he was 16 and she was 12, whose death had sent him fleeing into the wilderness, away from people, away from pain. "You were my best friend," she continued, tears streaming down her thin face now. "Do you remember? You taught me to skip stones on Miller's Creek. You carved me a whistle from willow wood. You said when we grew up, you'd build me a house in the forest where we could hear the trees sing." Eliza! Her name broke on his lips. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and caught her as her knees gave out. She was light as a bird in his arms, nothing but bones and will. "How? How did you survive?" "I ran," she whispered against his chest. "I was so scared and sick and confused. I ran into the woods and kept running. A trapper found me, took me south. I lived with different families, worked as a servant, as a laundress. I tried to come back, but I had no money, no way to travel. And I was ashamed. I was dirty and poor and broken, and I thought you'd forgotten me." James carried her to his chair by the fire and sat with her in his lap, holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "I never forgot you. Not a single day. Your death nearly killed me too. It's why I came up here, why I left everyone behind. I couldn't bear to be in that town, in that world without you." She pulled back to look at him, really look at him, taking in the man he'd become. His face was weathered and lined, his dark beard shot through with early grey. But his eyes were the same, that deep brown she remembered, warm as summer earth. When they put that sack over my head in town, she said, I prayed. I prayed that God would send someone kind. I didn't dare hope it would be you. How did you end up there? On that auction block. Her face darkened. The family I worked for in Timber Falls. The husband decided I owed them money for food and lodging. When I couldn't pay, he said I'd work it off or be sold for what I was worth. His wife hated me, always had. She's the one who insisted on the sack. Said no man would buy me if they saw my face. There's nothing wrong with your face, James said fiercely. You're beautiful. You always were. She touched his cheek with trembling fingers. You paid $2 for me. I would have paid everything I own. He caught her hand, pressed it against his heart. Eliza, I don't have much. This cabin, my timber claim, my horses and tools. But it's yours. All of it. I can't give you a fine house in town or fancy dresses, but I can give you safety. I can give you a home. I can give you the life I promised you when we were children. I don't need fancy things. Fresh tears spilled over. I just need you. I just need to stop running. Then stop, he said simply. Stay. Marry me. We'll go into town tomorrow and find the preacher. I won't have you living here without the protection of my name. Tomorrow? She laughed, a broken, watery sound. James, you just found me again. You should take time to think about this. I'm not the girl you remember. I'm damaged. I'm afraid all the time. I wake up screaming from nightmares. I flinch when people move too fast. I'm broken. He tilted her chin up, making her meet his eyes. So am I. Why do you think I live up here alone? I'm not good with people anymore, Eliza. I'm rough and quiet, and I'd rather talk to trees than humans. I have nightmares too. I'm broken too. Maybe we can be broken together. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt, for hesitation. She found none. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her forehead, gentle as prayer, and held her while she wept. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside, the fire crackled and the stew bubbled, and two broken people began the slow work of becoming whole. That night, James gave her his bed and slept by the fire. He fed her small portions of stew, knowing her stomach wouldn't handle more after who knew how long of too little food. He heated water and hung a blanket for privacy so she could wash. He gave her his spare shirt to sleep in, soft flannel that hung to her knees. And they talked. Late into the night, they talked, rebuilding the bridge between past and present, between the children they'd been and the wounded adults they'd become. She told him about the horror of waking in the mass grave. About the years of servitude, about learning to make herself small and quiet and invisible. About the constant fear, the hunger, the cold. He told her about his rage, about the years he'd spent punishing himself for surviving when she hadn't, about finding peace in the forest, in the steady rhythm of work, in the silence that didn't demand anything of him. I think God kept us alive for each other, Eliza said as the fire burned low. I think all the pain had a purpose. Maybe, James said. He wasn't sure he believed in that kind of purpose, but he wanted to. For her, he wanted to believe. The next morning dawned clear and cold. James hitched the wagon while Eliza dressed in her ragged clothes, the only one she had. He made a decision. We're stopping at the general store before the church, he announced. You need proper clothes. James, I don't need. You need a warm coat and a decent dress. You need shoes that don't have holes. You need these things, and I'm buying them for you. She didn't argue further. The ride to town was different from the day before. Then, she'd been cargo, a thing in a sack. Today, she sat beside him as an equal, as his intended bride, and though she was nervous about facing the town again, she wasn't afraid. Not with James beside her? The general store fell silent when they entered. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, stared openly. Eliza lifted her chin and met the woman's gaze steadily. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Not anymore. My fiancé needs a dress suitable for a wedding, James said, his voice carrying across the store. A warm coat. Good boots. Whatever else a woman needs. Fiancé. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Mr. Crawford, that's the woman from the auction. That's Miss Eliza Crawford, he corrected, emphasis on the name. My childhood friend who I thought had died 15 years ago. We're to be married this morning, and I'll thank you to treat her with the respect due my future wife. The temperature in the store shifted. Mrs. Henderson's shock gave way to something softer, almost approving. A love story, after all, was powerful currency in a small town. Well, she said briskly, coming around the counter. Let's find you something beautiful, dear. An hour later, Eliza stood in a simple but lovely dress of deep blue wool, a warm coat lined with rabbit fur, and new leather boots. Mrs. Henderson had even insisted on pinning up her hair properly. When Eliza saw herself in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. You look like yourself again, James said softly, standing behind her. I look like who I might have been, she corrected. If things had been different. You look like my bride. They walked to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street, and James asked the preacher if he'd perform a wedding. The old man took one look at their faces and agreed without hesitation. Mrs. Henderson, who'd followed them with her husband, offered to stand as witness. The ceremony was simple. No flowers, no music, no guests beyond the Hendersons. Just two people who'd loved each other as children, lost each other to tragedy, and found each other again in the last place either expected. Do you, James Crawford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Do you, Eliza Crawford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Her voice was steady, sure. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride. He cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, a promise of gentleness, of patience, of a love that had survived death itself. When they emerged from the church, word had already spread. A small crowd had gathered, and this time the whispers were different. Did you hear? They knew each other as children. She was his first love, everyone thought she died. He paid $2 and found his soulmate. God works in mysterious ways. James helped Eliza into the wagon, and they rode out of Timber Falls as husband and wife. The 15 miles home felt shorter this time, warmer, full of possibility. That winter was long and hard, as mountain winters always were. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. Eliza slowly gained weight, the hollows filling in, color returning to her cheeks. The nightmares came less frequently. She learned to trust that she was safe, that she wouldn't be cast out, that James's love was real and constant as the mountains themselves. James, in turn, learned to talk again, to share his thoughts, to let another person into the careful solitude he'd built. He'd forgotten how good it felt to laugh, to have someone care if he came home safe, to hear his name spoken with love. They built a life together in that clearing in the forest. Eliza tended a garden in the summer, put up preserves for winter, kept the cabin clean and warm. James worked his timber claim, felling trees with careful selectivity, always replanting, always thinking of the future. In the spring, a letter arrived from a lawyer in the territorial capital. The family that had sold Eliza had been investigated for fraud and abuse. 3 other women had come forward with similar stories. They were being prosecuted, and restitution was being arranged. I don't want their money, Eliza said, holding the letter with shaking hands. Then we'll give it away, James suggested. To women who need help. Women in situations like you were in. And they did. Over the years, they quietly funded a home in Timber Falls for women with nowhere else to go. They never advertised their involvement, but word got around anyway. The Crawford Home for Women became a fixture in the town, a place of safety and second chances. 5 years after that day at the auction, Eliza gave birth to a daughter with her green eyes and James's dark hair. They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought them back together. 2 years later came a son, whom they named Daniel, strong and serious like his father. The children grew up in the forest, learning the names of trees and the songs of birds, learning that love was patient and kind, learning that God could bring beauty from ashes and joy from sorrow. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, James and Eliza would sit on their porch and watch the sun set through the pines. She would lean against his shoulder, and he would hold her hand, and they would remember. They remembered the auction block and the burlap sack. They remembered $2 silver changing hands. They remembered the moment of recognition, the impossible joy of finding each other again. "Do you ever wonder," Eliza asked one evening, "what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day? If you hadn't bid?" James pulled her closer. "I try not to think about it. But I believe I would have been in town that day no matter what. I believe God put me there. I believe we were always meant to find each other again." $2, she said softly. "The best investment you ever made." He kissed the top of her head. "I would have paid everything I own," he reminded her, as he had so many times over the years. "You were never worth just $2, Eliza. You were worth the world. You always were." She smiled, that bright smile he'd fallen in love with when they were children, the smile he'd thought he'd never see again. "And you were worth waiting for. Worth surviving for. Worth everything." In the distance, an owl called, and the wind whispered through the pine trees, and two people who had been lost and broken and alone held each other close and knew what it meant to be found, to be whole, to be home. The town of Timber Falls never forgot the story of James Crawford and his $2 bride. It became legend, passed down through generations. A reminder that love could survive anything, that worth wasn't measured in dollars, that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever come back to us in the most unexpected ways. And in the forest, in a clearing surrounded by singing trees, the family they built lived and loved and proved every single day that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth believing in even when all hope seems lost. Years later, when the Crawford children were grown and starting families of their own, James and Eliza would sit on that same porch, hands still intertwined, hearts still beating as one. "Tell us again," Grace would ask, her own children gathered around. "Tell us about the auction." And they would tell it, the whole story, leaving nothing out. The fear, the shame, the miraculous recognition, the healing that came slowly but surely. They told it so their children and grandchildren would know that love was stronger than death, that faith was worth holding on to, that God's timing was always perfect even when it seemed impossibly cruel. $2, little Daniel's son would say, shaking his head in wonder. Great-grandfather only paid $2. And James, old now but with eyes still warm as summer earth, would smile and squeeze Eliza's hand and say what he always said, what had become the family motto, the words carved over their door and stitched into samplers and written in the family Bible. "I would have paid everything I own."